Woo! Let's go, folks. What's going on with you? Another edition of 86 Random. And you know what that means? That means you're talking 86 boxing, random acoustic thoughts. And we appreciate everyone in the mix here. How's it going there with your random?
Everything's good on my end, man. Good to see and hear you again so soon. Just a week later, and
Right.
excited to have this discussion.
Hey, boxing history must continue forward, as they say. But we appreciate everyone in the mix. Of course, those that will be here live with us as we're going through this discussion, as well as those who will be joining us on replay. So we have a pretty special episode for you here. Very interesting. It's more of a granular. We're diving into the weeds somewhat, and we're narrowing it down to a particular venue, right? So we're narrowing it down to a particular venue. If you saw the thumbnail, then you will see that is the Criterion Club in Boston, Massachusetts. Of course, Boston, Massachusetts, major fight town, top five fight town, if you ask me, when you look at it from a historical standpoint. And the Criterion Club, while it wasn't around for a long time, there were a lot of quality fights that took place with a lot of quality fighters during the period for which it was around. And that's something we're going to touch on right there. So, of course, if you're here, if you're listening, do us a favor real quick, hit that like button. If you can subscribe, that would be great. We would appreciate it for sure. So please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And that's not only myself, but also Random Acoustic Thoughts at Random Acoustic Thoughts. So everyone here on 86 Boxing, I want you to subscribe to at Random Acoustic Thoughts and vice versa. So this is a good one. So Criterion. This is the first time we've kind of dove into a particular club, and this one was of particular interest because of the fact that there were some great fights that took place there, random, and we had discussions in regards to such, and we kind of narrowed it down. This is a topic you had brought up, and I was like, you know what? That would be a pretty solid one right there. So the Criterion, Boston, I mean, doesn't get much better than Boston when you think about it from a historical standpoint, random. Can you tell me a little bit? And I think part of it is sort of the characters that were involved, but kind of what drew you to the Criterion?
Yeah, well, this is a club that appears in Sam Langford's early career journey. His first great win was at the club. It wasn't his first appearance before the club, but it was his first appearance. His great win against Joe Gans was at their new upgraded venue. So they'd been around since early '02, doing shows every week or every other week mostly. And in October, they upgraded to the old Cyclorama building on Tremont Street. Hold on, are you muted?
I'm going to pull that up.
Yep. So there it is today. That's the Boston Center of the Arts, 541 Tremont. The actual arena today is like slightly different address, and 541 is the name of the main building there, but it's the same thing. They rent that space out. They do plays there. I ushered a play there some years ago. And yeah, so it's a legendary venue that's been around since, I think it was the 1880s, the mid 1880s.
Yeah.
They'd already hosted fights there, but at the time, the Criterion took it over because their membership was growing and growing, and they just needed more space. And they had a high-end clientele. They had like a lot of prominent businessmen and movers and shakers in their membership. So by the time we're talking about, they were like the most prestigious club in Boston at that time. And you mentioned earlier, clubs not being around very long, but oftentimes they'd be doing shows every week or every 2 weeks. And so between all the different clubs doing lots of shows, there was a lot of boxing happening, even if an individual club may not have stayed around for more than a few years. A lot of the time, not all the time, but legislation changed, and you'd have a tragedy and something would clamp up and they'd close temporarily. And so so they had a pretty good run of things, to put it mildly, especially in their larger quarters. Now, the first fight in the new building was supposed to be Terry McGovern fighting the star of the East, Jimmy Briggs. Jimmy Briggs, very popular fighter, and then the former champion, featherweight champ, Terry McGovern. That was supposed to be the opening night, but McGovern hurt his hand in a 6-round no contest that he'd had with a guy, I forget who, I think it was in Philly, and he had to postpone it. So the Barbados Demon, the welterweight world champion, Joe Walcott, fought heavyweight contender Kid Carter in the opening show on October the 13th. And Walcott won on points, even though he was giving up a lot of pounds. But part of his specialty was fighting larger fighters. Walcott was really good at fighting, giving up size and still having a big effect. Powerful body shots. He had a wrestling background. And he was considered old school by this time, but so he might not have been considered like in his, certainly not a lightweight anymore, but in his welterweight prime. But he was the champion by default because he was so avoided by most of the welterweights, with only a few exceptions. And then he would also fight middleweights and heavyweights. So there we go. Yeah, October 13th. So Walcott opens up the run at the Criterion's new quarters with his great win over Kid Carter. Kid Carter had a tremendously difficult career, as you know, Josh.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think win some, lose some is really being fair to him. He had a stupidly difficult schedule, and he didn't quite win his share, but he won enough that he's not a fluke when he would beat high-level fighters. And Kid Carter, as well as Joe Walcott, they appeared quite a few times in this run of shows that we're talking about, that happened between October and January of the following year. So did you want to add anything on Kid Carter, just how silly his career was, like how difficult it was?
Yeah, so I wish I would have made an actual depiction for him, but I can actually pull up some of the opponents that he faced during his time in his career. But this is a guy who, while you associate him with certainly lower division, he would fight heavyweights. So you think about that, no different than Walcott himself right there. So both of these guys were sort of next level in that sense. But Kid Carter, some of the best names that one could ask for on his resume. And it's not just Walcott. He'll come up again, of course, as we know, not only just with Walcott, he'll come up with the likes of Joe Kowinski as well. So a very tough and rugged guy there. And I'm gonna pull up his actual box rec to. I'll have it here on this end at least, and I'll read you off some of the names that he was up against, since I didn't get to create a full depiction for him specifically. But just so you know, he has sort of an up and down record when you look at it from a visual standpoint. If you go to box rec immediately, you're going to see 36, 31, and 7 as far as what's listed there from an official record standpoint. But of course, with all of these, you take into account or at least we do, we take into account the no decisions, the no contest, all of that stuff. But I'll give you some of the names that he has on a resume just to give you a feel for the type of competition. So all of these, as I always say, wins and losses aren't created equal, right? So we got the likes of Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, former world light heavyweight champion right there, George Cole. But even with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, he also fought for the world heavyweight title. I should note that. But you have the likes of George Cole, George Gardner, as well on the resume. Now, he lost to these individuals. George Gardner, former world light heavyweight champion. You have Joe Kowinski, who he was able to defeat. Joe Kowinski he would have been, in my eyes, and I know Random's eyes as well, world light heavyweight champion. Had the timing worked out, and that division was around at the time that he was truly active or primarily active in the sport in itself. You have Marvin Hart, former world heavyweight champion. Joe Walcott, former world welterweight champion. Gus Rulin, former world heavyweight title challenger. You have Joe Butler, former colored world middleweight champion. Sam McVeigh, colored world heavyweight champion. I could go on and on. Peter Marr, Jack Root, former world light heavyweight champion. This just gives you a depiction of a Charles Kidd McCoy, former middleweight champion there. I mean, I could go on and on. He just has a crazy resume. So when you see some of these up and down resumes in a sense, or I think that's one way of putting it, then you have to understand that just the pace in which these individuals were fighting, as well as just the overall competition in between these fights, it was high level. It was a bit different, you know. And I'm not saying that we don't get some of that level of competition here today, but the difference is that oftentimes it was very early in the career for a lot of these individuals from the past to be put in with individuals who would be, or who would ultimately become, Hall of Famers or Hall of Fame level contenders, you name it. And that was the common theme around this particular time frame, you know. And there are certainly similarities between the different eras from an overall boxing standpoint, but by that same token, there are a number of differences as well. The sport in itself was just different because of the fact that the conditions were different. So here or at least right now in this particular time, we wouldn't think of Terrence Crawford facing Alexander Usyk. But that being said, back then, and I know we can dive into weights and things of that nature, but back then it wouldn't be uncommon for welterweight, middleweight, or whatever to be mentioned and end up ultimately fighting an individual who is competing at heavyweight, or who may be a heavyweight champion or previously a heavyweight champion. And I think that best exemplifies a Kid Carter. He's that type of fighter.
Yeah, and he's a light heavyweight in that he's small, on the smaller side for heavyweight. Not in every fight, but like, you know, he's mentioned as a heavyweight, but also as a light heavyweight. Think of him as a large light heavyweight who was capable at heavyweight, but not predictably so. But that was also said of Marvin Hart as he was growing from middleweight into the heavyweight class. You know, they said how much he was improving once he started to put on some pounds. That was true of other guys too.
And and random, I'll just say, and going off Box Rec, and I know it's not the end all be all, of course, diving into the further research, and that's something I would have to do as well. Kid Carter, he's weighed in as low as 120 pounds. So think about that. A guy weighed in at 120 pounds at some point in their career, going on to fight at heavyweight against heavyweight. So I just wanted to point that piece out there, Random. And of course, as I always note, you can do your own research, and I'm going off of what's listed in Box Rec. Of course, they do research on their end and all of that stuff. I will do my own due diligence to provide any further information regarding such, but I wanted to point that out. 120 to heavyweight.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yes,
wild. But he started young. I know someone had been mentioned the other day. He was always like younger in almost all, if not all, of his fights. Retired in his 20s. I think the eventual ban on boxing in Boston hit him pretty hard. He didn't have too many fights after. And I should have mentioned on the intro, so one of his fights in this series, the last one in this series, Kid Carter fighting Joe Chwainski, they got arrested after the fight. And that was the first, you know, fusillade in the bombardment of boxing in Boston. That was the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
When they got arrested. The grand jury refused to indict them, but police broke up more events, and a lot of the clubs didn't want to risk their overall charter over these events. So the Criterion, this ended up being the last boxing match the club held. But that's a little further away from where we are. You know, we're back in October, but yeah, when you get to mid-January, that's it for the. So that determined the end of the scope of our talk, was when basically Chwainski and Carter got arrested, and that was it. Criterion did do a couple wrestling events, but they didn't draw the same interest or pull the same money. Wrestling just wasn't as popular as boxing in America at that time.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so Walcott and Carter kick it off. Walcott gets the decision, so he's the welterweight champ almost by default, by fear. And but he does defend his title later this year in the building. On the 20th, Jimmy Briggs, the star of the East, Jimmy Briggs fights ex-champ Terry McGovern. McGovern beats him in this one. And then the week after that, the man who took the title off him, young Corbett II, fights Hugh Murphy. And I believe that was with the title on the line, the featherweight title on the line.
Well, real quick before we move from there, I wanted to certainly point out the significance, of course, if you don't know Terrible Terry McGovern there, Random, before we go to the Murphy Corbett. I mean, Briggs, he might not be a familiar name for many, but Terrible Terry McGovern, former world featherweight champion there, one of the big-time punchers that the sport has seen from an overall perspective. You see some of the names on the resume, including the likes of Joe Gans, Tim Callahan. If you don't know Tim Callahan, I'll do a video on him at some point. Oscar Gardner, Frank Ern, Young Corbett II, Eddie Hanlon, Tommy Murphy, Harlem Tommy Murphy, that is, Battling Nelson, Young Laurie, another top-flight contender from that period. I wanted to just take a second to recognize Terrible Terry McGovern. And on the channel, here on my channel, I do have a video that speaks to Terrible Terry McGovern taking on Joe Gans in their 1900 contest. I believe it was 1899 or 1900. But basically, I think it's the biggest fix or gambling style fix in sports history. I know that's major to say, especially considering here in modern times, we have a lot of stuff going on in the advent of these betting apps, betting sites, or fantasy betting sites, or fantasy betting, companies, etc. But that being said, I do think it is fairly significant. And of course, I think one that from a I don't want to say pop culture, but from a popular standpoint, that is often associated with being sort of the top of the line when it comes to fixes in sports is the 1919 White Sox or Black Sox scandal, actually. The Black Sox with Shoeless Joe Jackson and etc., and how that World Series was ultimately a fix. And that resulted in a lot of punishment, people being banned from the sport for life, of course, and that is stood. I know they've made some changes here in recent times, but that being said, I think that Gans versus McGovern is the greatest fix because of the fact that it affected, ironically, both of these took place in Chicago, but it affected Chicago and the greater state of Illinois in a way that boxing was banned in the state for 26 years. So even with the Black Sox scandal, you can say, or some of these other scandals we've seen here in recent times, it hasn't resulted in the entire sport being banned from a state for a prolonged period of time. As far as I know, if anyone knows any difference, definitely leave a comment. But that being said, when Gans and McGovern, that fight ultimately reached its conclusion, and then, of course, the punishment verdict or whatever it may be was handed down, boxing was banned in the state of Illinois for 26 years. So as far as I'm concerned, and based on the research that I've done, that seems to me to be the sort of most costly, the greatest, most grand of fixes in sports history. So I did want to point that piece out there, Random. So Terrible Terry McGovern fighting on that card, that is certainly a big deal considering he is certainly one of the all-timers as far as the sports is concerned. And if you look at some of the pundits, writers, etc., who've made the list of greatest punchers in the sports history, Terry McGovern is undoubtedly going to be on there.
Yeah, and he was a tremendous finisher, superstar, in part because he was such a finisher, multi-weight threat. And the controversy with him and Gans, their fight, yeah, that was a massive controversy. And I think after it was like boxing by special permit only in the state or something. So I've seen listings of stuff that happened in the state, but it's few and far between. So I think they went like, a club had to apply for a specific license for a specific fight, got all on lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a big controversy. But by the time, this is several years later, this is like 3.5 years later or 3 years later that we're talking about. And he's the ex-champ. He's still a huge star. He's fighting Jimmy Briggs, who's a big deal, who's considered the New England champ at that weight.
Hello, real quick plug. Random and I, we did do a video on Jimmy Britt. If you don't know him, which I know many people won't know him, I'll try to drop it in the chat there, Random, but continue forward. Jimmy Britt, crazy resume.
Oh, Jimmy Britt, yeah, and he had a rivalry with Gans that was really maturing by the end of 2003. And yeah, so Briggs was, so Briggs wasn't able to get past Terrible Terry. But then young Corbett, the man who had been able to get past him, he came in the next week. And Corbett ended up going, I think, 12-0-4 for the year in 1903. And he was basically, he was the man. He fought Hugh Murphy. It was a little overmatched, but Hugh Murphy did have 2 wins over Kid Goodman, who was very respected here in New England. So that would have got him, that might be what got him the booking from the club to be our representative, our New England representative in the matchup. That takes us through the first 3 weeks. And then in week 4, Walcott and Carter, they fight again. And Walcott wins again on points. So now he's 2-0 at heavyweight at the Criterion's new club. It also shows you when someone is popular, when someone was popular enough, a good club with money can really make a lot happen for them by putting them in, pairing them up with badass fighters, putting that money up. So you see with Walcott, he's got 3 bookings in a matter of weeks, because the 5th fight they did, week 5 of this little run, which was November 10th, he fights Big Sandy Ferguson, the New England heavyweight champion, and loses a robbery on points. But Walcott is 148 pounds for that fight. Ferguson is 205 pounds.
Crazy.
Size mismatch was bizarre. There was like at least a foot between them in height. But from what I seem to remember reading Ferguson got the decision, but it seemed like it was an iffy decision, and that he actually got outboxed for most of the fight. And it was like a cartoonish looking fight because of the different dimensions, but maybe the wrong guy got the nod from the ref. But so that's like Walcott's, we're 5 events into this run at the new building, and he's headlined 3 of those shows already. He's 5 events in, he's headlined 3 shows. So if you want to pull up the next graphic, Josh.
All right. Yeah, real quick before we do that, I want to pull this up again there, Random. Since we're talking about it, maybe we can dive a little bit further into them for those that may not know there, Random, on just the career that one Barbados Joe Walcott had there, Random. I wanted to touch on it real quick, and then we're going to pull up the other graphic. But if you don't know Barbados Joe Walcott, this is the inspiration for Jersey Joe Walcott. Now, many of you will know that, of course, if you dove into history, if you follow the channel and all that stuff. We spoke about it a number of times, but the inspiration for Jersey Joe Walcott, who is more famous than Barbados Joe Walcott, this is the inspiration right here. And despite Barbados being his sort of name, or at least what he went by, he is from Guyana. That's an interesting point I wanted to put out there, but also where he parallels, or where he comes to fruition in history from an overall standpoint, the first Black world welterweight champion in boxing history. The guy stood 5'1", which is another high mark for him. And it's hard to fathom, I would suppose, for many. Even I look at it myself, just think about like, wow, so bewildering. A guy who was 5'1", but of course, a stocky, solid, strong 5'1", being as formidable as he was in the sport in itself. And funny thing is, there's a common opponent who appears on this list, of course, Walcott, Joe Kowinski. Kowinski, really a light heavyweight who ultimately fought at heavyweight as well, a guy who knocked out Jack Johnson. But would you believe that Kowinski himself was knocked out by Barbados Joe Walcott, 5'1" guy who's really a welterweight, but he will fight at heavyweight. But he knocked out Joe Kowinski, the guy who knocked out Jack Johnson. Mind blowing. I know if you're hearing that for the first time, but it's something that must be pointed out there, Random. So I wanted to share that before we moved on, just how good Barbados Joe Walcott was.
Yeah, he really was. And he'd been a protege of Tom O'Rourke. And one of his future, well, I'll do them in order. I'm not going to get out of order, but he fights a former training partner and corner later this year as a title defense in this building. But we're not quite there yet. What we're up to is December 1st. Marvin Hart and Kid Carter go up on it December 1st. If you want, Josh, pull up that second slide of the events. Oh, yeah. December 1st, Kid Carter, Marvin Hart. This was a hell of a fight here. They were raving about this fight afterwards, you know, in the papers, and how good it was and thrilling. Both guys were down in the fight. It was absolute. Like, they were just so floored, thinking it was one of the best, if not the best fight that had happened in the area in years. But not to be outdone, the bookings kept coming. And the week afterwards, on December 8th, Sam Langford, who was living in Cambridge, adjacent to Boston, he got a title shot. This was his first busy year of boxing. And it'd been really busy. He'd had over 20 fights already this year. He got to fight great Joe Gans, the lightweight champion, booked as a title fight at 138 ringside. Sam missed weight by 2 pounds, so it was a 140. So it was a catch weights fight. The title he didn't get, but he did get the decision on points, which was a stunning result because Gans wasn't the kind of guy who just lost on points. And it would be years before Gans would lose officially on points or by stoppage. You know, so this is like he still has 4 to 5 years to go as champion. But Langford was able to get the best of him early in Langford's career. This was the beginning of his sort of international reputation. But this was also while Gans was fighting off challenges from rival claims to the lightweight title, like Jimmy Britt out in California was a very prominent example, whose brother had a lot of influence and whose family had influence in California, and they had money. And he had been an amateur star turned pro. Jimmy Britt had already beaten the ex-lightweight champs, Kid Levine and Frank Ernie, who Gans had also beaten. So he was like making a rival claim. Gans was fighting that off, and then he goes and loses the points decision to Langford. So even though it was at catch weights, there wasn't much sympathy for him because he'd already been booking a lot of fights above the lightweight limit, including, although it was a close thing, including where he won the title, was half pound over the official limit. Some guys are real sticklers for that. Others were more tolerant, but either way, just to be aware that controversy was there. So losing to Langford, it boosted Langford's stock, but it was also used to attack Gans. So it turned out to be a rather important fight on multiple levels. And the week after that, as close as you're going to get to like an influencer, it's like an influencer type fight. So you have Jack Monroe, it's a former minor who became famous, getting the best of the white heavyweight champ James J. Jeffries in an exhibition, knocking him down as an amateur, reportedly in a 4-rounder. And then he's fighting Al Limerick. Now, Monroe and Jeffries are in town doing theater appearances. And Al Limerick had made his name knocking down Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, another top fighter this time who we mentioned, in an exhibition, more recently in an exhibition. So this like two guys who got famous doing well above their level. They're going to fight each other because Monroe is angling for a big fight, big money fight with Jeffries, which he does eventually get, even though he looked terrible in this fight. They both looked terrible in this fight. And it was said there was no, like, you know, afterwards, the newspaper writers weren't very kind about it. or the odds of whether Jeffries would fight him, but he did fight him. And in that fight, Monroe was stopped by the first major punch that Jeffries landed and basically ended the contest. But at this time, this was like such was their momentum that they're coming off, some intense stuff. So that's fight number 8 in this run.
All right. Hey, real quick there, Random. Shout out
Yeah.
to Stop Motion MMA who came into the mix. We appreciate your Stop Motion.
What's up, Stop Motion?
Stop Motion, hey, fan of the history, and he does his own thing. Be sure to go follow his channel there. If you're listening right now, go follow at Stop Motion MMA 3158. Again, Stop Motion MMA 3158. But Random, yeah, while we're on that run of fights right there, of course, we can't just stop without speaking to the greatness of one Sam Langford there, Random Acoustic Thoughts. And of course, this is also someone that you are actually working on a book for the early career of Sam Langford. So we would be remiss not to actually dive into him a tad bit right there. Can you speak to him real quick, just because this is the magnitude of this individual fighting at the Criterion?
Yeah, so this was Langford turned pro in 1902, but just one fight at professional. He was his all amateur and pro run. 1902 was like 4 fights, 2 on the first night, then like basically 2 fights on the same night in January, a fight in February, and then one in April where he turned pro. And then he didn't come back for another 8 months and change. But mid-January, when he did come back in 1903, he was real busy. And so this was sort of like, this was what his fantastic year had added up to, is the fight with Joe Gans. And Gans kind of took him lightly. Now, sometimes you'd expect someone to make excuses and things, but Gans sort of tagged his fight on. It was booked with like a week's notice, and Gans tagged his fight onto his schedule. So he already had a fight booked for the night before in a different city. He's fighting Dave Hawley of Philadelphia, and Hawley's a serious guy. Just a 6-rounder. But 6 rounds of Hawley was serious, and the Gans actually took some punishment to the body in that fight that was said to affect him the next night. But Langford was having his own trouble because he was trying to make 138 on a week's notice.
Crazy.
And so he was running that whole day, trying to lose those last few pounds because he had a couple $100s of forfeit money put up saying he could make the weight. So he ended up losing that money after all that effort. He probably would have been better off just not doing all the running. But anyway.
Real quick there, Random, since you brought it up right there, forfeit money. We don't really hear that the same way these days, but I guess the equivalent could be the hydration clauses that are in contracts. But forfeit money, this was oftentimes put up by both fighters, and it was to ensure that the fight went through and there weren't any issues. And if it were, or there were to be issues, then of course that funding would end up going to the other fighter or the opponent for the opposing individual. I just wanted to put that out there, Random.
Yeah, precisely. And a lot of that's, put up or shut up, put money where your mouth is. So it's like, you can, like someone will post a forfeit with a challenge, and then if someone accepts the challenge, they match that forfeit. It's placed with a third party. Now it's considered like close to official because the money has been matched. And now if you mess up, the other party can go claim that money, get their money back, and take your forfeit. So It was a way of just like ensuring, like guaranteeing behavior, or at least putting some sort of risk involved in not following through. And so Langford didn't make the weight, but he did get a lot of fame. This made him world famous in sporting circles, the fact that he'd beaten Gans, because although Gans had a rough 6-round no decision against Jack Blackburn, who became a common opponent.
Oh, yeah.
It was a no decision. It wasn't official. This was actually the ref giving it a whole fight to someone on points against Gans, a 15-rounder at an important club. So this was like the bigger deal. And it was heavy. And Langford would go on to fight Walcott in 1904, the next year.
Crazy.
After the ban came down on Boston, he fought him in New Hampshire the following year. And then Walcott got injured. So at one point, the successors to Walcott in the discussion included Sam Langford and Joe Gans, because Joe Gans had ended up fighting a draw with him in 04 himself. So like they would measure great fighters against each other. And if you did well, like Langford having a points win over Gans and then a draw with Walcott, that spoke a lot to abilities. And in the math, in the boxing math that was going down in the wake of Walcott's injury in 04. But even before then, it was just like the way they would measure. It's why a lot of guys wanted to fight a lot of dudes, even across different weights, because it spoke to your reputation. All these different people and how you could do against them. And different claims, though, for titles and things had different levels of weight to them or different levels of acceptance. In the fight after the Monroe Limerick, not freak show fight, but like spectacle fight, the week after that, on December 22nd, Jack O'Brien, who we've mentioned, this great light heavyweight, well, he was making a claim at that time at 158 pounds. It's like an alternate middleweight. 154 had been the middleweight limit that Fitz had taken the title from nonpareil Jack Dempsey at. But O'Brien was basically saying, I'm a huge star and I'm the best 158 pounder in the world. And he was fighting Jack Twin Sullivan for that claim, defending that claim, basically, which he did with a 15 points win. So it was sort of narrowing down the mix at that weight. And, of course, forfeit money and the gambling side bets and things would make it worthwhile for the guys to have these matchups. So that's O'Brien and Sullivan, one of the Sullivan twins. Then on the 29th, the aforementioned Barbados Walcott made a title defense at welterweight against Larry Temple, who'd been a former corner and training partner to him and also to George Dixon when they were all managed by Tom O'Rourke. And then Walcott and Tom O'Rourke had a falling out. And then Larry Temple was like the next hot thing at welterweight that O'Rourke wanted to take over the prestige and the reputation of Walcott. And Walcott ended up retaining the title, but it was a close fight. And the first half went toward Temple's way, but then Walcott made a strong enough showing in the second half of the fight to retain the title. But it was a close run thing, and one of the high points of Larry Temple's career. Temple's a tough fighter. He ends up giving Langford a loss the first time he fights Sam Langford, to give you an indicator of how good he was. But that's Joe Walcott. So Joe Walcott's fought three heavyweight fights and fought for the welterweight title. Although I did see a report they may not have even weighed in for this fight. But had he lost, that would have been the title, because it was like advertised as such, and it was, if they chose not to weigh in, but they just did it. It was like, so it was for the claim, and it would have been interesting had Temple gotten the decision. He just didn't. But this is Joe Walcott again, showing his greatness across like not just these other weights, but his own weight, his own area. And then the next fight after that, my goodness, they just keep coming, right? So we have a 158-pound title claim with O'Brien Sullivan. Then we've got the 142, although they were both probably heavier than in the ring than 142. Temple was a little larger than Walcott. But the week after that, you've got George Gardner, who just in his previous fight, I think it was, lost the light heavyweight world title to Fitzsimmons, as Fitz was making history.
Real quick, there are a number of Sullivans out there, so I think we probably need a little bit of clarification on what Sullivan that is, actually.
Yeah, good point. So that's Jack Twin Sullivan. He had a brother, Mike Twin Sullivan. They were very popular fighters, both quality fighters. Jack was a little bit, I think, probably the better boxer, or he was slightly more famous. But later, Jack Twin would be notable later for giving Tommy Burns his last loss before he became the heavyweight champion. Yeah. Although it was a drag a bit on Burns' reputation, the fact that he had lost to this like high-level middleweight right before trying to take over the lineage that James Jeffries had commanded. Jeffries retired undefeated in 2005. Mm-hmm. So without anyone beating him, his claim still sort of like hovered over and shadowed over anything anyone else was doing at heavyweight. So, yeah, but Jack Twin was a very notable fighter, hence he's fighting O'Brien in this big matchup, this major venue. But then, so after Walcott and Temple, now you've got the recently dethroned George Gardner fighting Marvin Hart. I'm assuming this was to produce a challenger for Bob Fitzsimmons' light heavyweight title. But I think Fitz at this point was just trying to get back up into some sort of heavyweight contention. Like he being the light heavyweight champ didn't seem that important to Fitz, but I see it looks like he didn't fight for a couple years, and when he did fight again, it was I'm trying to remember who Fitz fought when he came back. It was Jack O'Brien, and he lost the light heavyweight claim in that next fight. So light heavyweight had some prestige because specifically top fighters, smallish heavyweights were willing to fight for it. But on its own, it didn't mean as much as just another way for a guy to try and get back in the mix at heavyweight, at this time at least.
Oh yeah. And
there was prestige there.
Yeah, so with that, in that regard there, Random, I want to take a moment there real quick so we can speak about some of these fighters. But shout out to everyone who's in the mix with us here at the moment. We appreciate you, of course. If you haven't, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe both channels if you can. But those are some very interesting individuals there. I think that, Random, if you could speak on the likes of Larry Temple. I think he's a name that most people don't know, but if you actually look back in this particular era, you'll see that he was a very formidable fighter who was in with a lot of the top flight competition and boxers who were around that we know of, and he's someone who may have fallen under the radar because he wasn't a world champion or any of that thing or anything of that nature, but he's a damn good fighter.
Yeah, very much. And he would I did some research on his early career because after a little bit looking, it seemed like no one really dug deep. That's where I found that photos amid my travels in the archives. But yeah, he fought. He cornered, Dixon and Walcott, and he was in that camp. And Walcott would kind of beat up on him, is what the word was, or at least that was the angle. By the time they were getting ready to fight, that was why he had resentments, and it just added to the drama of the fight. I don't know if it was true, but it was like there was certainly tension there. But Temple had a good run. This would have been I think he made. I'm trying to think who it was. Was it Eddie Kennedy? Maybe he had a really good performance out in the Midwest. I think it was Eddie Kennedy, a fight he wasn't expected to win that really like set people's hair on fire. And like, is he the next big thing at welterweight? And that drew the interest of Tom O'Rourke to like represent him as a manager, for his, again, because he'd already been sort of in the camp, but to represent him properly. So yeah, so Temple was very good, very underrated, mixed record, but he fought across multiple weight classes, and he didn't, he wasn't a fighter who stayed in one place and just kept plugging away at trying to get the same title and stuff. He had a pretty wild booking schedule. And so some of these guys, you just don't see them a lot because they don't factor a lot in title fights. Even if they give a really good account of themselves in a title fight like he did, he's just not known because he's just some guy that lost to Walcott, really, in the large scale, in the wider scope of things, like as deep as boxing history is, when you start backing away from things. He gets buried like lots of guys, but he was a serious guy.
Yeah, hey, no, that's real talk right there. And by that same token, Random, I think we should also touch on George Gardner, who kind of denied, in a sense, Sam Langford an opportunity at the World Light Heavyweight Championship, but a damn good fighter with a pretty impressive resume.
Yeah, or to be clear, George Gardner did not famously, but he did draw the color line on Sam Langford, but it was after he'd already lost to Fitz.
Yeah.
That was in 1905. So Langford was too small when Gardner was holding the title. Just to be fair to George.
And George is the second world light heavyweight champion in boxing history there, folks. And you see some of the names there on the resume.
Yeah, he fought some dudes, and his great rival Jack Root ended up fighting Marvin Hart for the vacant white heavyweight title after Jeffries retired.
Yeah.
And then Marvin Hart fought Tommy Burns, who just lost to Jack Twin Sullivan. And that's how Tommy Burns ended up with the title, taking it international.
Yeah.
So these guys all factored in. So light heavyweight had a lot to do with the heavyweight landscape, especially once Jeffries retired. But Jeffries was drawing the color line, so even though he was citing a lack of credible challengers, he had challengers. They just weren't white guys.
That's true, right there. And some of those challengers include Denver Ed Martin. I have a video on the channel on him, of course. Not in addition, Sam McVeigh. Sam McVeigh is someone who could have been in there with him. There's a video on the channel of him, and of course, a number of discussions we've had, even there random on Jack Johnson, who probably would have been the most formidable of the bunch in terms of Jim Jeffries taking him on, especially at that point of retirement.
Yep, Frank Childs.
Frank Childs, hey, that's another good one right there.
And even Joe Walcott at one point was calling
Right
out
on
Jim
Joe.
Jeffries, even though Jeffries was a rather large version of a heavyweight. But Joe Walcott, he liked the size disparities. He knew how to work with that. And in later years, Sam Langford would become expert at that same kind of thing, giving up size but turning the tables on the tall guy.
Oh
Just
yeah,
by knowing how to catch punches on the top of your head and punish them for having to punch down at you and learn to get inside on the body and all that stuff. So Langford, there was a template for that style that Langford made so famous, and Walcott was the expert. So it doesn't necessarily mean he would have beaten Jeffries, but he was definitely a credible challenger because he'd already beaten Kid Carter twice, we've seen, and then lost in a robbery on points to Big Sandy. You know, these guys are legit. So like it's crazy to think of someone that's short who without a weight cut is like 148. Being so dangerous basically in an open weight setting. But he was, and he was a rarity. But he also had a good amateur wrestling background, so Walcott, as well as disproportionate power. So he had some skills that factored in to his ability to jump weight. And so there are lighter weight guys who gave him more trouble than some of the big boys. Just a very unique fighter, Barbados Joe. But certainly it's not a mistake that, Arnold Cream wanted to pick a great fighter that, like, if he ended up with Jersey Joe Walcott in honor of Barbados Joe, hey, that's a good shout right there. Because he's considered one of the pound-for-pound kings of the early era. Like maybe a top 4 or 5 fighter of the whole, leading up to him getting hurt, 1904. He was like probably certainly top 10, but one of the top fighters to have competed in gloves at that point. Like he really was something special. And so but let me get back to the thing. So we had Walcott defeats Temple, and then Marvin Hart draws with George Gardner, 15 rounds. So they're trying to figure out, who's going to fight Fitz. Fitz is probably just thinking about heavyweight or thinking about not fighting and doing more exhibitions. He was good with that for the money. But now week 12, this is January the 12th, 1904. The second event they did in 1904. Dave Sullivan, who is a different Sullivan brother. He's the brother of Spike Sullivan.
Mm-hmm.
A different set of Sullivan brothers. He fights and beats Jimmy Briggs, the aforementioned Jimmy Briggs.
And I don't know a lot about Briggs there, Randall.
Yeah, Briggs, I think he was from Chelsea. He was a blacksmith. Outside of his boxing career, he was a blacksmith by trade. Had a lot of fights, very popular, tough guy, working, obviously super blue collar, but very popular.
Okay.
And he was considered the best at his weight for New England for a number of years. But it's just that, and we saw earlier, he got to fight, these guys, these are the types of guys from around the different sections of the country and world who would be fighting the young Corbetts and the Terry McGoverns, that would produce the various contenders. The clubs would think well of enough to put money up for purses to have these showdowns at these weights. So Briggs is a pretty formidable guy, but he loses this one. And I believe that leads us to the last fight in this run, which is January 19th, the fateful night where, if I'm not mistaken, Kid Carter stops Joe Chwainsky in a round, and then they're both arrested along with all their seconds.
Insane right there. And we were speaking random about Kid Carter, his career in the beginning of this stream, actually. But I think what puts it more into perspective is understanding Joe Kowinski. And I'm going to pull up a sort of a graphic that shows just some of the names that Joe Kowinski fought. The Cali Terrier. And it's insane because of the fact that this doesn't even include everyone that could have been on there. There's just not enough room on this thing as it's constructed. But look at the names there. In addition to Kid Carter, of course, Marvin Hart, former world heavyweight champion. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, former world light heavyweight champion. Peter Marr, claimant of the world heavyweight champion, the Irish Giant. Frank Childs, former colored world heavyweight champion. Jack Johnson, former world heavyweight champion, colored world heavyweight champion. Tom Sharkey, challenger of the world heavyweight title. Joe Walcott, who we spoke on at length, former world welterweight champion. Charles Kid McCoy, former world middleweight champion. Mexican Pete Everett, very tough guy right there. Video on the channel on him. You got to learn about him. Gus Rulin, world heavyweight title challenger. James J. Jeffries, former world heavyweight champion. Not only that, but he also helped train Jeffries in the lead up to his return against Jack Johnson. Joe Goddard, Australian heavyweight champion right there, one of the toughest in boxing history. Go check him out if you haven't. Bob Fitzsimmons, former world heavyweight, light heavyweight, and middleweight champion. C.C. Smith, the first colored world heavyweight champion. Bob Armstrong, former colored world heavyweight champion. And that's all that I included on here, random. But to say that he has one of the toughest, the most sort of insane, incredible resumes, especially considering the area, would be an understatement.
Yeah, and you can see what a guy can do when he's popular enough to get booking, but also not drawing the color line. A lot of great fighters in the mix there in those days. And so a guy like him who would fight across those lines, there were lots of great opponents. And you can kind of line up his opponent list to some of these other fighters who did draw the color line. You can see the difference it makes. You know, you can still have a good career drawing it, but you know, if you take him from the full buffet table of opportunity, you end up with a resume like Shoinsky.
Good point, Random, which is why I say, as far as the others who didn't, what's the excuse? We just saw what Joe Kowinski was able to do. He didn't draw the color line. So what's the excuse for the likes of a John L. Sullivan taking on a Peter Jackson, George Godfrey, or C.C. Smith? So, of course, something has to be thought out, or there has to be some asterisk or whatever it may be, just considering the fact, because while you can say, oh, it was just the times and this is the way it was back then, Joe Kowinski, it didn't matter for him. He fought those fights. I showed you what Joe Kowinski did, who he was in with at that particular time. Let me show this again in case you don't know. Jack Johnson, black fighter. Frank Childs, black fighter. Joe Walcott, black fighter right there. C.C. Smith, black fighter. Bob Armstrong, black fighter. Mexican Pete Everett, Mexican fighter right there. You can go on. We could even dive into heritage, all of that stuff. So really, what's the excuse for a guy who's at the top of the line being able to fight someone who may be from a different walk, maybe of a different race, different color, whatever it may be in fight? So you have to think about it from that perspective in itself right there, you know? So we can give them their credit. We can give them their recognition for what they were able to do in the sport. Of course, John L. Sullivan, the first world heavyweight champion in boxing history. And I'm not trying to pick on him. I'm just using it as an example. But what's the excuse when you have individuals like Joe Kowinski? We even spoke about Gus Gardner, while he may have drew the color line on Langford for the world light heavyweight title. You look at his resume in itself, he was fighting across the color lines, of course. Same with James J. Jeffrey, despite him not defending his world heavyweight title. But that being said, this is something we have to think about.
Yeah, and some of these guys, they would fight across lines, but then once the title was involved, they wouldn't risk it. And they just tried to put it up like it was something noble. There's nothing noble about it. It's just a different way to duck a guy. But you can see with Shoinsky what it looks like when someone doesn't duck much in the way of competition, and you can really fill a resume up with top elite names.
That's why he's one of my favorite light heavyweights of all time. Maybe my number one, actually.
I mean, you got to respect the list. Now, there were fighters like Jack O'Brien who did fight across the color line, but drew it at times out of convenience. There were fighters like that. George Gardner was another one who did that out of convenience, just at times. Tommy Ryan at times out of convenience, especially when Joe Walcott was trying to fight him. Tommy Ryan, the great welterweight and middleweight, he wasn't interested. But these guys can still have a great career. But like, if you want to find the toughest careers with the biggest level of opposition, usually you're looking at guys who didn't draw the line. So credit to Trainski and Kid Carter there. He had lost to Sam McVeigh earlier that year. Or I should say in 03. So he's another top fighter who was just fight a bigger spread of all the top talent. And yeah, but this was Judge Emmons, a former East Boston judge who'd never been particularly hot on boxing, been pretty hostile to it in the East Boston circuit. And yeah, he became the head of the police board and he directed them to shut it all down. So this was the beginning. And the last gasp was probably like February 22nd, 1904, which was the night Big Sandy Ferguson was supposed to fight Walter Johnson, a colored heavyweight, in Chelsea, and the police stopped that. And that was like the last gasp. So it took just over a month for them to just completely wipe it out and the clubs stop having events, boxing events in and around the city. And you can see in a lot of the early era records that around this time, like early 1904, a lot of the guys who were real busy, if they were popular in the Boston clubs, you see their busyness go down, way down. Because there just weren't as many places to offer them fights. It happened to Langford.
Oh, yeah.
And some of these guys have more than one home club. Langford had more than one home club.
My guy Stop Mason MMA said John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson, who wins? Look, I'm going to tell you it straight up like it is. If you look on my channel, I have a sort of matchup style video. This is one I did probably back in 2020 or 2021 or something like that. And I compare some of the different things that are out there. And I actually picked John L. Sullivan in that matchup. But since that time, I've changed my mind, or I was privy to new information. Shout out to Colin Cowherd, because he's done this before. And basically, I will say this. I think that Peter Jackson would have won. Now, you could argue that certain time periods may have factored in to make it a bit more of a challenging scenario. And I think that is true. So I think that when I was speaking on it with that video that I'm mentioning, I was thinking about sort of Sullivan at his peak there. And he was definitely a hell of a fighter for sure. Did he face anyone like Peter Jackson? I don't know. Maybe James J. Corbett, in the sense that Peter Jackson and Corbett actually fought. And that ended up being a draw with varying accounts as to who won. But consensus, I believe, or at least those here who dive into it, feel and kind of know that Peter Jackson may have gotten the better of Corbett in that particular matchup, and he was dealing with an injury at that particular time. In addition to such, I do think that Peter Jackson would have gotten it and was in all likelihood the greater fighter. And Sullivan, of course, hey, it said he had maybe around 500 fights and all of that stuff. I do think that he was a damn good fighter. And don't be surprised if he ends up on my list there when we do our top 10 heavyweights list here next week. But that being said, he didn't face all of the top competition, and that goes beyond just race there as far as who he faced in his career. And I've noted that in some videos that I've done and such. But that being said, Peter Jackson, at one point, I think he was the top heavyweight, bar none, and he had the majority of the titles that existed out there at one point, or at least those major titles. And I do think that he would have defeated John L. Sullivan at his peak, which would have been in that probably 88, 89 through 1890 2, 3, 4 time frame or something like that, but certainly 1892. And I think that's where I stand here at this particular day. But Sullivan, one hell of a fighter right there. And you go through different time frames and scenarios and different versions of each fighter. Of course, both of them could get a win because Peter Jackson, it was challenging for him very early on in his career, but he was going against some of the best fighters in history there early on, including the likes of Bill Farnan, an Australian heavyweight champion who would have been a hell of a challenger and someone Sullivan didn't face that possibly could have happened, at some point in time in their careers there. So I wanted to point that piece out there in regards to that, Random.
Word, that's what's up. Yeah, I don't have, for me, I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other about who would have won the fight between them at different times in their careers, but certainly would have been a great matchup. And I got to agree with Stop Motion. Tommy Ryan and Barbados Walcott is an incredible matchup. Yes. It would have been at welter or middle. I mean, basically, Walcott just wanted to fight. He was always the smaller of the two guys, but he was always challenging. Couldn't get the fight. Would have been a good matchup. And I might favor Walcott in that slightly. But Tommy Ryan was incredibly great. I think Tommy Ryan was also good enough to recognize that Walcott might not have been a good matchup for him stylistically.
Yeah, so that's dope, and that's good, and that's where sort of that contrast in terms of when we're discussing these things. I love it right there, Random. I love it because in that matchup right there, I might favor my guy Tommy Ryan. I have a video on the channel on both of those guys, but one that dives a bit further is the video that I do have on Tommy Ryan. And I think that would have been a hell of a fight right there, as Stop Motion had noted right there. But I think I would have leaned Tommy Ryan, who would have been the longer fighter, and then just the skill set that Tommy Ryan possessed. I think that could have potentially saw him through. Now, in a series of fights, I think that I could see scenarios where the two of them exchange wins or whatnot. But certainly, man, Tommy Ryan, one hell of a fighter right there. And we're thinking about it from the skill set standpoint, what the tools that he brought to the table, the attributes, the mind, and all of that stuff. Damn good fighter. And he has a pretty impressive resume. And that resume has some of the top tier names in the sport associated with it. As a matter of fact, let me see. Do I have something on him? I think I may have a little depiction here. Then again, maybe not. But that being said, do note that he is one of the most formidable fighters in boxing history, though he doesn't often get mentioned as much, especially when you think about the greatest welterweights of all time. But he was not only just one of the greatest welterweights of all time, but he was also one of the greatest middleweights of all time as well. But Tommy Ryan, one hell of a fighter there, Randall. But I love the fact that we have these different sort of contrasts or scenarios surrounding these fighters.
Yeah, they were both really great fighters. So it's one of those things where even if one guy was making it harder than the other was to make the matchup happen, doesn't automatically mean he'd lose.
Yeah, true.
But Tommy Ryan was an awesome fighter, as was Barbados Walcott in his own way. Just different kinds of awesome, these guys. I think yeah, but certain guys, so you can see in Walcott's run here, a lot of these fights at the Criterion, the larger venue, he's up there, he's fighting a bunch. So between October and, within 4 months, he's fought 3 times at heavyweight, and he's defended his welterweight title claim. It's pretty heavy duty for a guy who's 5'1" and change, under 5'2". Pretty miraculous. And Walcott had faced all kinds of adversity, not just the color of his skin or his nationality or anything like that, or losing his powerful manager, having to start over his managerial oomph. But he had a lot of people gunning for him. And then others like Tommy Ryan, who couldn't get the fight that he wanted. But yeah, these are all very serious people, and who knows what would have happened. It's just if for some reason Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler hadn't come together. There'd be speculation, right? As it happens, they did get it on. Or certain matchups, we'd be like, well, what would happen? You know, and we see that with the others in the Four Kings, or you could throw in Benitez and some other guys, you know, who were interacted with the Four Kings, Barkley.
Oh yeah.
You know, where some of their results suggest they might have been really interesting in the wider mix because of how they did against these certain great fighters. That happens all through boxing history, you know, and so yeah. So even though, like, say with like Walcott, Tommy Ryan couldn't happen, but they had some common opponents, you know. So sometimes these guys who can't fight each other, they have end up with a lot of common opponents. But like with Sam Langford and Jack Johnson, they had one fight. They never got their rematch on, but they did end up fighting a lot of the same people.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting. So you lets you as a historical enthusiast get the measure of someone a little better. You start looking at common opponents with other rivals, how everyone was doing. You can. That's kind of what they did a lot of back in the day, because guys were pretty busy. Even the champions, a lot of the champions even would stay busy, even if it wasn't all championship fights. Yeah, I can see with Walcott. Yeah, he fights Kid Carter twice, fights Big Sandy. Then he fights Temple for a welterweight defense, but he had 3 other fights in that several weeks there. So it's not just, so that's a partial explanation why he doesn't have more title defenses. We had other stuff going on. There's better money at heavyweight. Whatever size you are, if you can handle it, there's better money at heavyweight. So yeah, it's pretty wild. So there is a timeline where, I don't know, maybe if Joe Walcott doesn't get a robbery decision against him, against Big Sandy, maybe he's the one fighting Choyinski at the end of the year. I mean, the beginning of the next year, the night the hammer came down, the band hammer came down on Boston. You never know.
Yeah.
So, you know, it doesn't take much to like push things around. That's true of like things today too, like injuries people suffer or events in their career or unexpected losses they have. Like when Joshua, we think of AJ when he was supposed to fight Big Baby Miller, and then Big Baby got caught on the thing. And so in steps Ruiz, short notice, he's not expected to win. But he does, and that throws a whole heavyweight landscape into disarray.
Oh yeah.
You know, and the dust has settled largely now, years later. But yeah, it was a huge result to change the landscape. And we see that throughout history. And we saw a little bit of that here with these Criterion Club events. A little bit of stuff happening here and there, like Langford winning from Gans on points is a big deal. A big deal. Because when was the Gans? So what was it 1908? Gans finally lost the title.
When Gans lost it, you said?
Yeah, was it 1908 or 07? I forget.
Might have been. Let me see. Yeah, I don't remember off top. You know what I'm saying? Could have been. Yeah, it could have been.
But it was years after. Langford beat him in December of 1903.
Yeah, so that was a good deal beyond that.
So even though Langford had outgrown the lightweight class or even the catch weight, you know, where they fought, Gans remained famous and considered like the greatest of the lightweights. Very quickly was in that discussion like that for years without losing the title. Even though Langford had outgrown the specific matchup, he was still gaining more and more fame as Gans got more and more famous. Langford got a side benefit while he was doing his own thing. So,
yo, 08, battling Nelson.
Oh, okay, yeah. Certain wins age like wine.
Second fight, though.
You know, just like certain wins, they really age well because of common opponents with other people who did big things. Like Choyinski. Walcott's win over Joe Choyinski because of the factoring of Choyinski's win over Jack Johnson. Where you go, whoa, wait, what happened?
Right.
You know, so certain guys, young Peter Jackson had some heavy hands. He had some surprise results. Barbados Walcott as well. Later in years, Langford would have some real heavy duty results considering he wasn't that big of a guy again compared to his opponents. Although he would start his real weight traveling at like the end of 1905, but Langford was destined to fight a lot out of his class, just giving up size and weight almost routinely. So it's heavy, but this run of shows, unfortunately, the ban came down in Boston, and that was it. The different clubs tried to hold out. So Langford's home clubs tried to hold out. The Central Club, one of his two home clubs, was one of the last to give up, but they did give up eventually. Langford even competed a couple times when the police were in attendance. Both times he was against Belfield Walcott, which is Barbados Walcott's younger brother, who was a lightweight and
Nice
training partner of Langford's.
Nice
so
fighter.
they fought in Scituate, Rhode Island earlier in the year, a 20 rounder, but then in 2004 they fought twice. Amid all this controversy with the bans and stuff in early 2004, they fought twice short fights at the Central Club with police there. One night they were in uniform, the other night they were plain clothes. But regardless, needless to say, they had a pretty timid fight. They're not trying to get arrested for banging it out, like when they should be. So sort of a controversy. Is boxing prize fighting, or is it a sport? Is it an athletic endeavor, or is it just people gambling? And so Judge Emmons, in his opinion, it was prize fighting and needed to be stopped. But they also stopped amateur events. So then it kind of belied what had been said. So it's like, you just don't like boxing, huh, bro?
Right.
Because otherwise, why would you not allow the medal ranks at least to pursue events? But there was also a discussion that happened amid all of this, which was whether they were trying to come up with some sort of state law that would address boxing and make it legal, but restricted. So there were people advocating for private club boxing only, and other people wanting public exhibitions of boxing, open to the general public, as opposed to private clubs membership only. So in the wake of the initial thing, while the grand jury was waiting to return their results, this was a big discussion, was like, what form would boxing take? Would it be a private thing for members only, or is it a public? So yeah, there was and this happened in a lot of different markets. There was a lot of controversy in figuring out the form it might take and what was acceptable. But things would change. Boxing would be back in Boston. There would be, even in that building, the Armory Association was a subsequent club that started doing events in 1908. And Langford featured in some of their shows in that same building. They re-renovated it, but yeah, and they might have leased it in 2007, but they started doing events, I think, in 1908. And one of Langford's early fights with Joe Jeanette, one of his great rivals, happened at that club.
Yeah, and hey, by that same token, just thinking about Boston as a whole, I mentioned John L. Sullivan earlier. One of his high marks of course, is the fact that he was one who helped to make boxing popular, not only across the nation, of course, but in Boston. He was at the forefront there, and he went through a number of different things, both legally and illegally, in order to get the sport to where it is, or at least the iteration and version of it that we know here today. And there are sort of some sacrifices he made as far as what he was able to do, especially being a proponent, the leading proponent in glove boxing, sort of ushering it in from that bare knuckle era, where he did have some bare knuckle fights, of course, but he was truly someone who helped usher in the gloved era, because, of course, the heavyweight that was sort of, or the heavyweight division that was sort of the beacon mover, and he was the most popular guy around that time. Him and Nonpareil Jack Dempsey, who was mentioned earlier, but most certainly Sullivan was that guy for sure. And as Stop Motion says, the face of boxing. Certainly the first face of boxing right there, as we know it from a glove standpoint.
Yeah, and also like around this time when the ban came down in Boston, Harvard University wanted to revive boxing there because before his presidential days, Teddy Roosevelt had boxed while he was at Harvard.
Yeah, friend of Sullivan too.
Yeah, so there was like a history. Boston was like one of those main areas where stuff happened. And so it remained so, but it was on off, and because of this intermittent, not persecution, but you know what I mean, like different administrations and different people of power and means had different opinions on how righteous it was to have people doing this, and whether it was prize fighting or sport, or if it even mattered. And it should be fine if it's both. So there were writers who were saying the side bets would get them in trouble. And that was what the state authorities would use to ban it, was the side money, not the actual main purses the clubs were offering.
Shout out Rock Chalk. True crime. Appreciate you there, Rock Chalk. Always
up,
great
Rock
to have you in
Chalk?
the mix. Thank you for dropping by there, Rock Chalk. Hey, folks, if you're here right now, be sure to go follow at Rock Chalk True Crime, especially now. I'd imagine there's some stuff there. We know about some of the things that are going on right now in the true crime world. There's a search for someone and all of that stuff right there. But I appreciate you there, Rock Chalk True Crime. I see you. Hey, I see you as well there, Rock Chalk. Hey, folks, be sure to go subscribe to Rock Chalk True Crime right there. I think you'll enjoy it. We were talking about a boxing situation that happened in the last stream that we did and all of that stuff. But Rock Chalk, she brings you the real right front and center right there. So appreciate you. Much love there to your Rock Chalk. Thanks for dropping by.
Yeah, it's very cool. Yeah, so as far as like, just from this little slice of this one club, although, yeah, prestigious club, you could see how much they got done in a short amount of time. October 13th through January 19th the following year.
Mm-hmm.
What was it? 13 events, was it in the end?
Might have been somewhere around there.
Let me take a look. Yeah, Kid Carter and Chorinsky was the 13th event since October.
Good to go.
Yeah, so it's just 3 months away. Goodness me. Got a lot done in that time. Those are a lot of important stuff. I mean, you got title fights, you got kind of freak show welterweight versus heavyweight fights, but the welterweight great against heavyweights. You know, is he really Joe the Giant Killer? Then you've got like former champion trying to fight one of the top rising heavyweights / light heavyweights, where Marvin Hart and Gardner, they fought even. You know, I mean, you got a lot of talent on here, as well as the regional, what were considered at this time the regional New England champs. Sometimes they were the same thing. Like Barbados Walcott was the New England welterweight champ. He also just happened to be the world heavy welterweight champ at the same time. Whereas Jack Twin Sullivan was considered the New England middleweight champion. So that's why he would end up getting booked by the Criterion to fight Jack O'Brien for his 158 pounds claim. So a lot of these fights, there's some important stuff going on. Then you've got obviously former champion Terrible Terry, as well as current champion Young Corbett II. Got a little bit of everything for everybody, you know. Then you got like the freak show, Jack Monroe and El Limerick, sort of like slightly iffy fight, but there's money involved if they can get Jeffries in the ring with someone, so everyone's kind of playing along. Yeah, just a wonderful spread of events for just 13 shows that happened all in this short period of time. Just figure, yeah, October 13th, so November, December, January. Yeah, it's barely over 3 months. We got all that, so it's pretty heavy duty. But if you extrapolate that out and you add in more influential clubs, and there were a lot of clubs in Boston at this time, had the ban not come down, the landscape could have been considerably different. A lot of top fighters lost a lot of top opportunities, as well as some contenders lost their opportunities because there's just less events. Once you have, you know, the Boston clubs closed. Now other clubs opened in other towns, and it balanced out a little bit over time, but it was never, you never get it all back. They never got it all back. It's just a hit that the sport had to take, but it happened later with like with Jim Jeffries' return fight against Jack Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to be doing that in California, and then California was like, "Nah." So they ended up moving the fight, but So legislation moved underneath what was happening and overtook events. So you'll have that. So it's like been a constant fight at this time that we're talking. It's a constant fight. But yeah, every time they'd have a tragedy or like a controversy of some sort, people be like, oh, that's it for boxing, or it's another blow, another black eye for the sport. Including what was said when like the McGovern-Gans controversy, but not just that one. There were other ones. It's just they didn't all end in quick KOs. But there were fights where they were like, oh, you guys were trying to have an easy go without telling anyone. And then, of course, the people betting on the results get salty because they don't want to be betting on a fake fight.
Oh, yeah.
So there was, there is an undercurrent of gambling under this. It's not that Judge Emmons and others were wrong about there being a lot of gambling around boxing. There was. There definitely was. It's just that not everyone was wholly against gambling. Not everyone had that moral stance. So.
No doubt. It's been around. And it will continue to be around.
Yeah, so just one of the controversies of the day. What can you do?
True.
So and a lot was left unsaid in the press as well. So I don't have all the details. No one does. No one ever will. But we can infer certain things or at least know some things that we can kind of have a sense of. And a lot of the attacks on boxing were also an attack on gambling and public like drinking. Like the Rowdy Cloud. People like to go out, have a couple beers, watch some fights, lay some coin down on it, your casino going crowd today, I guess. But, so it was different times, but as far as historically speaking, this win for Langford kept him famous. Like this win was famous for his whole career.
Yeah.
Even into the 1920s. The papers would be like, yes, as incredible it is, the same guy who beat Joe Gans at the Criterion in 1903.
Which is insane. And we've talked about it before. We've talked about it before, but that's insane. Yeah. Beat Joe Gans, of course, the greatest lightweight of all time, or most certainly one of the 2 or 3 greatest lightweights of all time, depending on how you rank things. And Langford was in with pretty much the greatest heavyweights of all time as well. So that's even more insane when you really think about it.
Yeah, Langford's career is extra crazy. But Joe Walcott's was sort of a preview of that. Just Walcott was smaller, so his effective ceiling was lower. But also Walcott's overall career was smaller, so Langford took it to a new extreme that people didn't maybe even imagine could exist. But the template was out there for people giving up size and giving up weight to get opportunity and to get more money, bigger purses. But, like we were said at other shows, Fitzsimmons had been the middleweight champion before winning the heavyweight championship. Marvin Hart had been a middleweight turned light heavyweight turned heavyweight. And he beat Jack Root was more like light heavyweight solidly, but George Gardner was also considered like a heavyweight / light heavyweight. And then middleweights making up to the heavyweight class to at least contend wasn't new. Tommy Burns, former middleweight, became one of the heavyweight champs. So Sam Langford, another guy who started below middleweight even, who passed through middleweight and went on to win the colored heavyweight titles and be one of the top contenders in the heavyweight bracket in general. It's pretty wild stuff, but it wasn't. They didn't have to look far back to see examples of it happening where people could go from middleweight up to heavyweight and be a top guy. Jack O'Brien proved it later, where he could be one of the top heavyweights in the world, even though he started further down at middle, made his fame at middle. So yeah, so that partly explains it. So Walcott had been a welterweight who was willing to go to heavy, but these other guys are a little bit larger, so their ceiling was higher, if the skills could hold up. There weren't many people more skilled than Barbados Walcott at giving up size, but certain guys like Langford was the guy. And he was bigger naturally than Walcott, so he was able to do more with it, I think. Combination of the two.
Yeah, no doubt about it right there. And yeah, both of those guys get exemplary feats just from an overall standpoint. And when you think about pound for pound, the greatest, and why some people note Sam Langford as being the greatest. I think it's just the way in which he was able to scale the weights, considering where he started, and bringing that power with him in being able to dispatch of some of the greatest heavyweights in boxing history. And shout out there to Alexander Campbell in the mix there. Appreciate you there, Alexander. Viva Ukraine, as always, representing, showing support. No doubt about it there. So shout out to you, my guy there, Alexander. But yeah, we've been here talking about the Criterion Club and its legacy. We've noted 1903, which was probably the peak and premier year for it. And it went on until 1904. Though, yeah, if you look on BoxRec, you might see some beforehand, but they're beforehand and after the fact. But that being said, they're somewhat of anomalies in some sense. But Boston, Massachusetts, without a doubt, one of the premier fight towns in history, and it's sort of unfortunate in some sense, though boxing, of course, still takes place there in Boston, and they had what I would say was a major show here a few years back. But that being said, it hasn't had that same luster that it had at the turn of the century during that particular period there. But there's still fighting, of course, that goes on and such. But man, we're talking about one of the premier fight towns, as mentioned, and it can measure up against pretty much any city in world history as far as fighters. The amount of just elite level fighters are some of the greatest fighters of all time have fought there. But that being said, doesn't have that same sort of boxing fight buzz as it previously had, and you would think it would still be there, but I think it's just a part of the times there, Random. And of course, you're in that area, so hey, you would know better than anyone.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where the history of boxing is so long and rich. So there have been times when Boston was a major player, right? But today they're just the business is different. So the industry is different structurally, and it's just not the case now. But there were times, especially at this time, the Criterion, when they refitted and upgraded their rooms and moved into the 541 Tremont Street, that was considered one of the best venues in the country at the time. There it is today. You can see the round building. That's the part that survives from back in the day. The rest of the Boston Center for the Arts is built around it. So, but it's yeah, so I mean, it's been there kicking butt since the 1880s, but not always as a fight venue. It's had different roles over the years. But that was, like as far as the timing of everything, a couple more months, like Langford had that great win against Gans in December 8th, 1903. Well, it was only like 5 weeks later, the club was closed. And that was it. The 19th, right? January 19th, the next month. So he really did fit that great win into a very small window. Because in situations like these, it does help to have a major venue or a major club, athletic club, willing to put up the purse, and like host the fight.
Yeah. That's insane to think about, and we've seen it with other venues and such, but that speaks to just how sort of, the old saying that here today, gone tomorrow, just like that, things can move on. We've heard here in recent times of some of the things that have, or at least we can speak from a historic standpoint, some of the top cities that are no longer premier in that sense. Boston, San Francisco, you would argue New York, even though we still have a number of big fights there. But there was one point when you think about it from a world standpoint, Boston, New York, they're probably the top two. And then you think about Philadelphia, and some of the greatest fighters just in general have come out of Philadelphia. And as far as I'm concerned, just from what I've looked at, studied from a historic standpoint, if I were to rank one city across the entirety of the planet Earth, I would put Philadelphia number one as far as the number of greatest fighters produced right there. When you look at it from a historic standpoint, just think about it. We have some big fights that do happen there. Shout out to Boots Ennis because he's brought some big fights back there. And then there are other things taking place. Some of them don't reach that same level of sort of I guess interest or sort of popularity. But that being said, I mean, this is one of the premier fight towns and producers of fighters in the world. So it's very interesting, and it truly is a situation where things can shift just in a matter of years, and you can go from being the premier spot to sort of an afterthought in some sense. Look at Atlantic City, New Jersey, and what it meant there, late 90s, early 2000s, all of that stuff. Now, not that it's necessarily an afterthought, but that being said, we don't have as many of the big fights that took place on the regular during that particular period. And I have been there for a number of fights here in the past decade or so or whatnot. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, like watching a certain number of years where if you're watching a lot of these classic fights on YouTube, they're in Atlantic City, in one of the casinos there, and like, yeah, some good fights. It's Philly over the generations. There's been had a lot of good moments, a lot of good eras. Boston quite haven't had as many, and it's
certainly not here in modern time.
Number one.
Yeah, with Boston not in modern times, certainly not many.
Yeah, and then you have like a sort of revival, someone like Hagler and
right.
The other guys have been popular, but like it's not like it had been in the past. It's Boston's heyday is far in the past.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's hit a high mark as far as where it was in this time of the likes of Sullivan, Langford, you name it there, who were fighting during these periods. And that is saying something considering, of course, while they are big names, we've had some names that are, I was going to say even bigger, but I would say even bigger now, though from a peak perspective, they may not have been as big. You know, we think about Rocky Marciano, he's more Brockton, Massachusetts, Hagler, and all of that stuff. They were popular fighters and all of that stuff. But Sullivan at his time was arguably the most popular human in the world. And if not that, the most popular sports figure in the world. So you got to think about it and look at it from that lens right there. So that makes it interesting to think about.
Yeah, it'd be like basketball in Chicago, and you mentioned like Jordan's career or something.
Right.
There are times when it means more because whatever's happening is bigger than just a simple factor. There's like a lot of stuff going on that's has a cumulative effect. There's a snowball effect on its importance. But I think, yeah, this time that I've been discussing here that we've been talking about, you could argue was the peak. Certainly one of the peak moments for Boston's. Maybe not so much when, when the Boston Strong Boy was like you said, the most famous athlete in the world, one of its biggest overall stars. But next to that, you could say it's a pretty strong time at the end of 1903. It's looking good.
Oh,
multiple title fights in this great venue. You know, all these top fighters are coming in. Plus, you have, like a superstar like Joe Walcott fighting way outside of his class, but at a credible club. Criterion was serious. So, like Walcott fighting Kid Carter twice and fighting Big Sandy Ferguson, that's legit. It's not like a sideshow fight. These are big bookings. And yeah, so you had a lot of stuff going on, but like it couldn't last. It certainly didn't last in this case. But that's life, that's how it goes. So, that's why part of what made me think it would make for a good discussion, Josh, was that it didn't last, and it happened to end, or the beginning of the end came at an event at this club in their new larger venue.
And sometimes it doesn't take long to make history. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. And within a month and a few days of their arrest it was by the 22nd, it was apparent that Judge Ammons and the police commission, they were going to not allow boxing. They were trying to pull in the state authorities to help with the ban statewide.
Oh yeah.
I've never shot a 45, but dang.
Shout out to Alexander out there at Tim
Get
Clark.
those earplugs.
Here's a ring. Hey, you putting it in 45, 1911. Hey, Alexander's out there putting in work right now. So salute to you there, buddy. That's funny.
Oh, big up, Josh. What's up, man?
Shout out to Josh Taylor. And of course, I say it every time now because I have no choice but to say it. But of course, relative of the great Charles Bud Taylor. If you don't know him, learn about him. I'm going to do something on him, Josh. I've said that before. I haven't started anything yet, but here eventually I am. I got a video I'm working on right now, which will be my first one in a good bit. But Charles Bud Taylor, folks, look him up. If you don't know who he is, one of the all-time greats right there. Kind of speaking on what we're speaking about with some of these cities and all of this stuff. There's also a number of great fighters that some of their recognition seems to wane, and people, there's so much stuff out there people tend to forget. But one of the absolute greats of all time right there, Charles Bud Taylor. Shout out to Josh Taylor in the mix there. Appreciate you there, buddy, for being here. Indeed.
Yeah, maybe we can do a discussion at some point that involves his career, or overlaps with his career, where he'd be a factor.
Oh, yeah. Why not? Yeah, and why not? That is something we should do there for sure. I'm down
for the show with this because this is like a lazy booking by me because this overlaps with my research. So I was like, so I've already looked at it to some degree. All good. So yeah, we can totally do that. That'd be fun.
Yeah. Hey, and in that regard, of course, Josh, yeah, we've been going on here we're about we're a little over an hour and a half in, but hey, you listen to the replay. We talk about some different things in regards to these fights at the Criterion here in Boston at that particular time there, 1903 to 1904 really is what we focused on. But that being said, next week, a big week there for us, random acoustic thoughts, because finally, I repeat, finally, we'll get to the point where we are going to do the discussion that we've had planned for a good period here on the 10 greatest heavyweights of all time, to include ties, I must note. But the top 10 of all time, hey, everyone's criteria may different. Of course, there's no wrong answer, no wrong list, or whatever it may be. Different opinions, different sort of assertions regarding some of these top 10 lists of it or whatever it may be. But this is generally a first for me, of course, and I believe for random in this capacity. But we're going to do our top 10 heavyweights of all time, though we will include some sort of ties in particular areas. And I guess we'll kind of just know that and find out about it when we go through the actual reveal in itself there, random. But I'm very much looking forward to that one.
Yeah, me too. And it's tough ranking the heavyweights, so many different ways to see it. But I look forward to it. Yeah, we're going to allow ties just for ease and overall ranking, and to cut down on the amount of time it'll take us to do a ranking we can stand behind. So we're going to allow each other to use tied places just to, so it could be a grouping. We don't have to go down into the molecular detail on small nuances and whose career was better.
Oh,
we don't even have a criteria, so we don't even know how each of us are ranking yet. We're going to find that out partly as we go.
Bring your popcorn because it's going to be very much interesting. I will say that, and hey, it may ruffle some feathers in some area, but as I said, hey, everyone's entitled to an opinion. There's really, truly no wrong answer. We may see some that ruffle feathers or some that we question and maybe interesting. You didn't include that person, or you included XYZ. But that being said, hey, everyone's entitled to their own opinion in that regard. And Random and I, we're going through it, taking it from a broad lens, factoring in some things that may not be the same things that you or the next person may factor in. But of course, it's going to be our list right there for what it's worth. But I'm very much looking forward to it there, Random. And I think it's going to be a very interesting show. So it's going to be next week, 6 p.m. Eastern time is when we're going to kick it off. We'll try to kick it off right then and there. But It's going to be one that I think informs a number of things on some of the greatest heavyweights that the sport in itself has seen.
Yeah, definitely. I look forward to it greatly. We'll have to
No
make
doubt
up some
about it.
graphics, or maybe just make up your list graphically, and I'll do the same for my list, and we'll just unveil it. That way, we're each surprised a little bit.
Oh yeah,
Maybe
hey,
that's the way to do it.
we could do something. We can go with a sort of common theme and or whatnot. We'll go buy them, an individual graphic for each or whatever, and yeah, we'll harken on. So what we'll do? How about we do it like this? We come up with the or we kind of decide on what the sort of graphic will be. Yours will be in red. Mine will be in that sort of safety green, lime greenish color or whatever. And we'll
Got it.
go back and forth from there, but it'll be the same layout essentially.
Yeah, I
Let's keep
like
it
that.
like
I
that.
like that. Let's touch base on that.
Cool,
I'm
cool,
feeling it.
cool. I'm down for
Awesome.
that.
It's been a lot of fun, Josh.
Hey,
I think
no,
that's
hey,
probably.
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks for listening, folks. We don't want to belabor what points there are to be made about this, but this was a nice little chat we had about the final run of the Criterion Club, which crescendoed very close to the end of its run. I mean,
Yeah, no doubt. And hey, we're not affiliated with the box rec or anything of that nature or any site really. But if you want to look for it yourself, check out Box Rec. Go in there and you can dive into a number of those sites that were at the Criterion that we mentioned. We mentioned some of the top ones that are there. But that being said, that's a good way to dive even further and even look into sort of the ones that we mentioned further as well. And of course, we just kind of share with you the information that we have and we go from there, but certainly be sure to do your own research. And we appreciate those that chime in, provide their comments, etc., because that all adds to it. Boxing history, this is a continually evolving thing, and it will continue to go forward right there. We're just two stooges, stewards, or whatever you may call it, that are in the mix of something that goes very, very deep right there. So, as always, there, Random, I appreciate you being in the mix here with me, buddy, and more to come in that regard. And of course, if I haven't said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Random Acoustic Thoughts is working on a book on the greatest Sam Langford, the Boston Bone Crusher. Is going to touch on some of those things in his earlier career. And I think you'll be very much intrigued about it there. So I wanted to note that.
thanks, Josh. Yeah, and it partly answers the question, or attempts to, like, how did Langford manage to give up so much size and still be very successful in his prime as the smaller guy, sometimes the extremely smaller guy? So that's something partly what I'm hoping to answer with this book.
Oh, yeah. That's going to be some good stuff. Well, I think I'm going to go play a little bit of guitar there, Random. But yeah, you heard it right here first and foremost. So be sure to hit up Random Acoustic Thoughts. If you're on 86 Boston, be sure to hit him up right now. Subscribe to that channel and go check out some of the stuff that is out there right now, because there's some very good stuff. And I think you'll enjoy it, especially as it relates to Sam Langford and some of the individuals that we've talked about here on this very stream. So be sure to check out at Random Acoustic Thoughts. You see it right there on the screen under Random's picture there, which includes the great Barbados Joe Walcott. Though with that being said there, Random, man, I appreciate you, as I had noted. Appreciate everyone being here in the mix. And real quick though, Alexander asked, do you have a publisher for the book yet?
I do have a willing publisher, but the exact means by which I'm going to get this out to the people is still somewhat in the air. I'm not locked into any one thing. I'll say it that way.
Good stuff there. So, hey, yeah, definitely be on the lookout, Alexander. Hey, we'll be in touch there for sure. We're going to definitely get that information out. Certainly, I'm going to push it on all the channels that I have and all that stuff. But, hey, kudos to Random, because he's been working on this for a good minute there, folks. Believe it or not, you know what I'm saying? This extends to years. You get what I'm saying? So he has been working on this. So this is going to be informed. So I think you'll really enjoy it. And shout out to Clay Moyle, who has a book on Sam Langford. And that one adds to the mix. So Random's book, it adds to the mix right there. As mentioned, it's going to speak on some of the early career stuff right there. So we'll get to see how he came to be prior to him becoming the greatest of all time right there. So I think you'll all enjoy it and all that good stuff. So thank you all for your interest in such, but we will definitely share it on this channel, and there'll be some other ones as well. Alexander mentioned he has Clay's books, and Random has definitely gone through that one. That's been an inspiration and such. So I think it's going to be a good addition.
Yeah, it's a great book, and my book basically is just a supplemental type endeavor, just talking about the earliest parts of Langford's career. So there's no need to try and rewrite Clay's book.
Oh yeah,
it makes no sense. He did such a good job. But the early few years, Langford did so much. No one book could cover 300 plus fights in equal detail. So I'm doing those first however many dozen fights over the first several seasons. That's really where my focus is. That explains somewhat the miraculous results he was getting later in his prime.
Can't wait for it right there. Hey, maybe even one day we'll get Clay on. We'll talk him, Langford, just in general, you know, all the three of us or whatnot. So look forward to that for sure there. Without a doubt there. But yeah, appreciate everyone in the mix here as usual. But be sure to tune in next week. I think you're going to enjoy this one. Top 10 heavyweights of all time there. So it's going to be a lot of chatter. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of controversy, information, etc. in all different directions. But we appreciate all of the interaction right there. So with that, thank you all for joining us here tonight. Be sure to enjoy the rest of your week and weekend, and we will see you next Wednesday, Random and I, that is, in another edition of 86 Random, or Random 86, depends on how you want to put it there. So salute to you all.
Take care, everybody.